What's going on, YouTube, and welcome back to Goal Line Hockey. It's your boy Kevin Forte. And today we are taking a look at the Ottawa Senators and what I think they could be capable of doing here ahead of this year's NHL Trade Deadline. So let's take a look at the Ottawa Senators. So we're going to start off with, what is some of the positives and what's going to affect what they're going to do at the deadline. So, a positive thing this season is the improvement from some of the younger players, specifically Tim Stützle. He has, it's so frustrating because this is a guy that we've seen him play so well. You remember in the beginning of last year, he couldn't score a goal. He couldn't afford to buy a goal. Like anything he would do would not go in the back of the net, but you saw the potential of what he could become, and we're seeing the benefits of that patience this year. The emergence of some of the younger defensemen on the back end, Jake Sanderson, Eric Brandstrom, to varying degrees. The Senators are finding their rhythm. They're finding that groove. Yeah, it's not going to be a playoff team this year, but they're building something. And I think this is a very good season for them to kind of build off of going into next year. But what else can they add ahead of the deadline to make them even better? So, the goalie injuries have really plagued them. We know that's been a problem for them. This is a team that, the injury bug has been a very big issue for them. And I think that hasn't helped their cause. And I think if they had a capable goaltender that could be healthy and in the lineup and stable, they would have had a better opportunity to make the playoffs. And maybe where the Red Wings are, the Panthers, sort of a little bit further up in the division, maybe even Buffalo, right? So at this point, I have them as a conservative seller. And that could go to the point of potentially them even becoming a buyer. And we're going to get to that. So let's get this right off rip. Alex DeBrincat will not be traded. I have him in the thumbnail because I know that conversation is stirring. Alex DeBrincat's not getting traded. The Blackhawks, the Senators are going to do everything in their power to keep him around because I think he's a huge part of the reason they've actually improved from where they've been at the basement of the Eastern Conference. So I think keeping DeBrincat is a huge priority for this team. You're seeing some of the growth around him. He might want to stick around. I think a lot of it has to do with he wants to see where the ownership goes when they sell the Senators. A lot of this contract negotiations isn't necessarily the negotiations itself. It's more so about who's going to be the long-term. If he signs an 8-year deal in Ottawa, he wants to know that it's a stable ownership, that he's a part of their mission, a part of the plan that they are trying to do. So this whole DeBrincat trade stuff, it can come up again if he's not necessarily happy with the new ownership. But until then, that conversation can completely die right now. With that said, what does the lineup look like for this Senators team? So right now we're looking at Brady Tkachuk, Josh Norris, and Matthew Joseph. On the first line, Alex DeBrincat, Ridley Gregg, and Claude Giroux. Brassard, Pinto, and Batherson as your third line. Pinto, shout out to you from Franklin Square. So that's what you're looking at there. On the back end, you've got Shabbat and Zub, Sanderson and Hamonic, Brandstrom and Holden. And that's an important thing, specifically on the right side, Zub, Hamonic, and Holden. Because they've got some young right-shot defenseman prospects that are just budding into the NHL. And these are guys that could either be traded to improve their offense or their goaltending, or could be guys that instantly make the team better next season on the blue line. And I think Jacob Bernard-Docker and Lassie Thompson, as much as they're on the quote-unquote trade bait board, they're not really going to get traded, more than likely. Unless the Senators really don't like what they've seen from those guys, I don't really see them getting moved. And, I think when going into this deadline, I think it's going to be fairly quiet for the Senators. But what you can expect, likely, is they try to trade Cam Talbot for some depth draft picks. I think Cam Talbot, at this point, again, he's injured right now. He's played okay for the Senators at points this season, so he might be a good third goalie option for a team, just looking to add that third goalie depth going into the playoffs. I think an interesting team, as crazy as this sounds, I think the Rangers could go in on Cam Talbot, bring him back to New York as a good third goalie. But other than that, I just don't see them getting much for Talbot at this point. Travis Hamonic, I think, is another one they should try to trade if they can. Hamonic is going to be an interesting piece, as well as Nick Holden. Both of those guys, right shot defensemen. So probably the teams that either don't want to give up the assets for Luke Shen or Joel Edmondson or Chikrin will probably be in the sweepstakes for Hamonic and Holden. And they're kind of the opposite end of the spectrum of guys like Klingberg and Gostisbehere. They're the very defensive-minded defensemen, and I think that when you look at it in that sense, they are going to probably go for a third, fourth, maybe even a fifth or sixth round pick on trade deadline day. They're going to be kind of the B, C, or D option for teams if they don't pick up the right shot defenseman that they want. So you're not going to get a ton of value for those guys. That's really all I think the Senators would be willing to move. I think the whole DeBrincat stuff is just, again, we've already talked about that. So I think it's going to be a fairly quiet deadline for the Senators, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Who else could also be on the block? We've heard Tyler Mott's name out there a little bit. I think the Senators fans like Tyler Mott. But again, it's just, you're in a contract year. You're not really sure what's going on with him in the future. You have a lot of young guys coming up like Pinto and Greg and stuff like that. So where does Mott really fit in this lineup? He's in the bottom six. Does he want to get paid like a bottom six guy? These are all discussions that the Senators are probably having with Mott right now. Like I mentioned earlier, the two young right shot defensemen in Jacob Bernard-Docker and Lassie Thompson. I think it's very crucial that they figure out what's going to happen with those guys because, again, when you're looking at this team, these are two guys that you ideally want to keep. But again, there's a lot involved here. Bernard-Docker is an RFA this summer, and Lassie Thompson is an RFA next summer. And considering some of the other good prospects they have, Jurian Donovan, I know they really like him. Thomas Amara, these are very young players behind Docker and Thompson. They are on the left side, but again, we've seen with Brandstrom, he's kind of either or. He could be a left shot or right shot defenseman. There's a lot of flexibility with some of these guys. I know they do like Artem Zub, so it's going to be interesting to see what transpires. But I think it's ideally you want to trade out guys that are on pending deals, and that's why I think unfortunately guys like Derek Brassard, Hamonic, Cam Talbot, as well as Tyler Mott and even Austin Watson are probably guys they should try to trade before 3 o'clock on March 3rd. Now, what do they need? So what do the Ottawa Senators need is a very interesting question, but it's not really that hard to figure out. They've got a lot of good prospects. They have a lot of good players on this team, but they really need another top four right shot defenseman, hopefully to complement Lassie Thompson and Jacob Bernard-Docker on the right side because, Artem Zub, Hamonic, Holden, they're just not great options there. And unless you're going to see the emergence of Brandstrom becoming that top four defenseman that's now a little bit older, maybe he could be one of those guys. But I think ideally you should be looking at some other players there, and we're going to talk about some of those guys in a minute. They also need a starting goalie. And again, ideally you want some guys that are maybe in their mid-20s, similar to a right shot defenseman here. You want a guy in their mid-20s, a little bit older, that can at least handle playing with Thomas Chabot, playing those top minutes, playing the best players on the other team. That's really what you need here because the second you throw Bernard-Docker and Thompson to the Wolves, that might hurt their development. So keep them on the second and third pairing and allow somebody to take the brunt of the minutes, a little bit more experience, and can play alongside Thomas Chabot. That's really what you're looking for in a defenseman, probably this summer more likely for the Ottawa Senators, and something similar to that with a goaltender. You want a goaltender that's got a little bit, he's been peppered a little bit. That's why I think Karel Vejmelka would be a great fit there. But I just don't know if that's going to work out. But that's something to keep an eye on. Some of the targets that I have for the Ottawa Senators, like I said, it's really more focused on the defensive side of things. I don't see them picking up a goalie here. So you're looking for a top four right shot defenseman, ideally between the ages of 22 to 26, ideally. And their deal doesn't expire this year, but ideally next year. In the summer of 2024, either an RFA or a UFA. And that's ideal for the Ottawa Senators because they get a little bit of term on a guy and they're able to figure out, all right, is this guy a good fit here? And can he be a guy we see long term without buying him as a rental at the deadline? And that's if they go for this at the deadline. So guys that could be available at the deadline, Evan Bouchard of the Oilers. The Oilers are trying so hard to get rid of that contract. I honestly think Evan Bouchard would be a nice fit in Ottawa. I think just a change of scenery would be great for him. Maybe playing alongside Thomas Chabot could really get him going. Again, not ideal. He's definitely struggled in Edmonton this year, so you would hope that Edmonton retains some of that salary on Evan Bouchard. But we've seen what the Senators have done in the past, right? They've bailed some teams out of some bad contracts. Dion Phaneuf of the Leafs. I'm trying to remember the other defenseman they took. Was it Mikheyev? Maybe no, it wasn't Mikheyev. You guys will let me know down below. But there was a defenseman that the Senators took from the Leafs after the Phaneuf trade. I want to say it was Zaitsev. Zaitsev, that's who it was. So they could do something similar here with Evan Bouchard. They have the cap space. They could make it work. Dante Fabro in Nashville just hasn't been able to get to that next trajectory in Nashville. Maybe he's a guy that the Predators, considering they're trying to do a mass sale-off potentially this summer, that could be a guy they go after. Another guy in Nashville, Alex Carrier, I think is a really good defenseman. He kind of struggled a little bit this year, but he's still playing well. And definitely could go for, again, a decent price. But, again, they fit that perfect range. RFAs next summer. They got a little bit of time to figure out their contract stuff. I think that's really what you're looking for the Senators. And even into this summer, if they want to pick up a guy during free agency, don't want to give up the assets, I think Damon Severson is a really, really good asset if the Devils don't decide to retain him. They've got a lot of defensemen in New Jersey, Ryan Graves, Damon Severson, all on expiring deals. And you look at some of the new guys coming in, Simon Nemec, former second overall pick, Luke Hughes, former top 10 draft pick of the Devils as well. The Devils have a lot of guys coming into that blue line that I think they could, I think they could end up making a pretty big trade here, but I think the Ottawa Senators could really be a nice spot for Severson. And you want to talk about a good defenseman to potentially play with Thomas Chabot. I think Severson is a great solution to that. I also threw Scott Mayfield on here as well. I don't think the Islanders are going to keep him around. I really think he's going to the Blues, so I'm not really that confident in him going up to Ottawa. But I think the St. Louis Blues, again, depending on if they're really if they're kind of rebuilding, do they want to take on a Scott Mayfield contract? And maybe they aren't willing to do that. So maybe the Senators would be a good fit. So with that said, let me know what you guys think down below. What do you guys think of the Ottawa Senators going into this year's trade deadline, and really more so into this summer, because I think it's going to be a fairly quiet deadline for the Sens, And like I said, it's not a bad thing, because now you're not trading out some guys. You're not trading out Pajot this year. You're not trading out Stone. You're not trading out cornerstone pieces like Carlson. I think this is a good thing for them, that they're finally keeping some of their core players, and they're finally building this thing up. They don't need draft picks. They don't need prospects. They just need to develop these guys and see them develop into National Hockey League players. And that's where the Senators are at. It's really a good thing for them. Shout out to Ali Dez. Really excited to see what this team turns into, because I think the Senators' future is very bright. They just need to get a good goaltender, and they need a good, little bit seasoned, but still young, right shot defenseman. I think those are the key priorities for the Senators. Let me know what you guys think, and I will see you again next time.